The sun had barely risen when Amma stood at the farthest edge of the village, her figure small against the endless sweep of fields and forest. The morning mist curled around her bare feet, but she did not shiver. She had grown used to cold glances, to whispers that cut sharper than any blade, to laughter that rose behind her as she passed. Children pointed at her with mocking fingers, their voices carrying cruel nicknames taught to them by their elders. Women gathering water from the well turned their backs as she approached, shielding their jars as though her very presence might poison the contents. Men spat to the side when her shadow fell across the path, pretending she did not exist even as their eyes followed her with suspicion. Amma had long since stopped answering them. Words she had learned were wasted here. Silence was her only armor, and solitude her only companion. Yet even as they mocked, she carried within her a secret that pressed heavy against her chest. She was not what they said she was. She was not the curse they named her, nor the foolish girl they dismissed. There was power in her blood, knowledge in her bones, visions that came unbidden in the dead of night when the world was still. But she had also learned that no one listened, no one believed. And so she waited, her heart bruised but unbroken. At times, when the nights grew too long and loneliness wrapped around her like a cloak, she wondered why fate had chosen her. Why she had been born different, carrying a gift that felt more like a burden. She longed for a single kind word, a gentle smile, but the village gave her only ridicule. Still, there was something in her eyes that never dimmed, a quiet fire that even scorn could not extinguish. On that misty morning, as the roosters crowed and smoke began to rise from cooking fires, Amma turned her gaze toward the heart of the village. She heard the laughter floating in the air, the voices that had never welcomed her, and her lips curved in the faintest of smiles. For deep within, beneath the years of mockery and pain, she knew a truth they could not yet see. One day, when the weight of their pride crushed them, when the walls of their arrogance crumbled, those same voices would call her name with trembling lips. One day they would kneel before her, not in mockery but in desperate need. Amma's earliest memories were not of lullabies or gentle embraces but of laughter that stung sharper than a whip. From the moment she could walk among the other children, she was marked as different. Her eyes, a shade too bright, seemed to catch the sunlight in ways that unsettled the grown-ups. Her dreams spilled into her mornings, visions of events that had not yet happened, words that carried meanings too heavy for a child. When she spoke them aloud, her peers only giggled, and the adults waved their hands as if shooing away a fly. At 5, she warned her mother that the cooking fire would leap higher than it should, and by dusk the clay pot cracked in two, scattering stew across the floor. Instead of awe, there was anger. Her mother, embarrassed before the neighbors, hissed that Amma should stop speaking nonsense, that her tongue would one day shame them all. The neighbors, watching from their doorways, whispered that the girl was touched by spirits, and not in a way that brought blessings. That night, Amma curled beneath her thin blanket, listening to the hushed voices carry her name like a curse through the mud-walled homes. When she tried to play with the other children, she was pushed aside. They taunted her with songs made up on the spot, calling her the crow's daughter, or the spirit's child. Stones were sometimes tossed at her bare ankles, small enough to avoid true harm but sharp enough to pierce her pride. Once, when she joined in a game of rolling hoops, a boy snatched hers and shouted, "Your visions didn't tell you this, did they?" The crowd of children erupted in laughter, leaving her to walk home with dust on her cheeks and humiliation in her chest. Yet Amma did not harden completely. Even as she swallowed her pain, she found ways to show a hidden kindness. When one of the younger girls scraped her knee, it was Amma who tore a strip from her own garment to bind it. When a boy's goat wandered too far into the bush, it was Amma who tracked it down, her sharp eyes catching the faintest trail. They would accept her help in the moment but never thank her. Gratitude was swallowed quickly, replaced with the same mocking tones by the next sunrise. Still she gave. Something in her heart refused to let bitterness win, though it clung to her like a shadow. The adults were no better than the children. Old women at the market muttered that Amma's presence soured the fruit. Men at the gathering tree claimed she distracted their sons with strange talk. She once told a farmer to gather his maize early, that rains would spoil the harvest if he delayed. He laughed in her face, calling her a silly child, but weeks later he cursed loudly when storms swept his fields bare. Even then he never admitted her warning had been right. Instead he accused her of bringing the storm. Amma learned to live with silence. She stopped sharing her visions aloud, stopped trying to join the games. She walked through the village like a shadow, ignored but never invisible. Inside she carried wounds that no one saw, wounds that festered quietly. But alongside them grew resilience, a strength she did not yet understand. Every insult, Every cruel laugh, every dismissal layered upon her spirit like stone upon stone, and without knowing it she was building a foundation. The irony of it all was that the very things they mocked would one day become their salvation. Her unusual eyes, her haunting dreams, her quiet endurance, those were the traits that would set her apart when the time of reckoning came. For now, though, she was simply Amma, the strange girl of the village, the one they all mocked in daylight and whispered about in the dark. And though she carried the weight of their scorn, she also carried a truth they could not yet see: she was not broken. She was becoming. Amma's gift revealed itself slowly, like the dawn stretching across the horizon, subtle at first but impossible to ignore once it had risen fully. As a child, she thought everyone saw the flashes she did, the flickers of events not yet happened, the strange knowing that pressed against her chest before something unfolded. It began with small things. She would wake in the morning and tell her mother not to walk barefoot because the clay near the river had grown slick. Hours later, her mother returned limping, having slipped and bruised her foot. At first, her family dismissed these warnings as childish guesswork. But the more often they came true, the more uneasy people grew. By the time Amma reached her 10th year, whispers of her curse traveled faster than the wind. She could glance at a goat and murmur that it would not live through the season, and sure enough, sickness would claim it. She told a young boy to avoid climbing a certain mango tree, that the branch he favored was weak, but he laughed and climbed anyway. The branch snapped beneath him, and though he survived with only a broken arm, the boy's family spat when Amma passed, accusing her of bringing misfortune into their lives. The villagers did not understand, nor did they care to. They preferred simple explanations, and Amma was a convenient one. To them, her gift was not a blessing but a threat. They saw her not as a child touched with foresight but as a vessel carrying bad luck. If she spoke, it was said she was inviting disaster. If she stayed silent, they muttered that she was plotting. She could not win. The cruelest blow came one harvest season. Amma woke trembling from a dream in which dark clouds smothered the sun, rains pouring down before the crops had been gathered. She ran through the village, breathless, urging farmers to cut their maize early to save what they could. Most laughed, waving her away with hoes resting on their shoulders. "A child teaches us how to farm," they jeered. A few chuckled and said the sky had been clear for weeks, that no rain would come until much later. Amma, desperate, begged them to listen, her voice cracking with fear. 3 days later, the rains arrived without warning, pounding the earth until the riverbanks spilled over. The maize, heavy and uncut, rotted in the fields. Families wept at the loss, knowing the season ahead would bring hunger. Yet instead of remembering Amma's plea, they twisted the story. Some claimed she had cursed the fields by speaking of storms. Others said she had called the rains herself, that her very tongue summoned destruction. No one admitted that she had been right, that her gift could have spared them. It was then that Amma began to understand the danger of her own voice. If she spoke the truth of her visions, she was mocked or blamed. If she held her tongue, she at least could pass by unnoticed. Silence became her shield. She bit back her warnings, swallowed her fears, and let the weight of unspoken truths settle inside her. But the mockery did not stop. The children still sang cruel songs, the adults still muttered as she passed, and every glance held the same unspoken accusation: "She is not one of us." Yet Amma's silence did not erase her visions. They came stronger than ever, vivid and insistent. She saw shadows of sickness creeping toward the village, saw quarrels that would tear families apart, saw dangers no one else could sense. Each time she stayed quiet, a part of her heart ached, but she reminded herself that to speak was worse. Better to carry the burden alone than to invite another storm of ridicule. What Amma could not know was that this gift, the one they mocked, the one she herself began to despise, would one day be the very thing that saved them all. For now, it was simply a secret curse, a truth buried beneath their laughter, a lonely fire flickering within a girl whom no one believed. Amma had always clung to the hope that, if the rest of the village turned its back on her, her own blood would not. Family, she thought, was the one anchor in a storm of ridicule. But as the years passed, even that fragile comfort began to slip away, thread by painful thread, until she stood not only mocked by strangers but wounded by the very people who should have stood beside her. Her mother was the first betrayal she felt most deeply. In the early years, her mother defended her with half-hearted words, telling the neighbors that Amma was just a child with an overactive imagination. But as Amma's visions grew sharper and gossip around the village grew louder, her mother's patience wore thin. Instead of comfort, Amma was met with scolding. "Keep your mouth shut," her mother snapped after Amma once warned that their cooking fire would topple. "Do you want everyone to hate us more than they already do? The look in her mother's eyes was not one of fear for Amma but shame, as though she carried a burden too heavy to bear. Eventually, even her mother joined the whispers, muttering under her breath when Amma's predictions came true, as if her daughter had caused the misfortune rather than foreseen it. Her father, a man of few words, turned colder with time. He stopped meeting her gaze, stopped answering when she greeted him. He drank longer at the gathering tree with other men, and when someone joked about the witch child in his house, he laughed along instead of defending her. Amma remembered the sharp sting of that moment, her father's laughter louder than the cruel words themselves. From then on, she no longer waited at the door for him to return in the evenings. But the wound that cut deepest came from someone closer to her heart. Amma had one childhood friend, Kofi, a boy she had grown up with. In her loneliest moments, he had shared stolen mangoes with her and played near the stream when others refused. She thought him different, thought him loyal. But loyalty is fragile when tested by the weight of a whole village's scorn. One afternoon when the children were gathered near the well, Amma approached, hoping to join them. The moment she arrived, someone muttered a taunt. "Careful, the spirit's daughter might curse the water." Laughter broke out. Amma tried to turn away, but then Kofi's voice joined the chorus. He grinned, wide and false, and shouted, "Maybe she'll see the future of how dirty your faces will look." The other children roared with laughter. Amma froze. It wasn't the words, she had heard worse. It was the betrayal in his tone, the eager way he spoke just to earn their approval. She had trusted him, believed he was different. But in that moment, Kofi chose the comfort of the crowd over the bond of their friendship. When their eyes met, his darted away, ashamed but unwilling to stop. Amma walked home in silence, her chest hollow, a space inside her collapsing in on itself. She never spoke to him again. Even her younger sister, who once clung to Amma's side, began to drift away. She grew embarrassed of being seen with her, fearful of sharing in her ridicule. At first she avoided Amma quietly, making excuses, but soon she too joined the others, laughing when cruel jokes were made. The shift was subtle but final, like a door closing slowly until it locked. These betrayals did not just wound Amma, they reshaped her. Each broken tie was like a branch snapped from a tree, leaving her more exposed to the storm. Yet the more the wind battered her, the deeper her roots burrowed into the soil. Pain became a teacher. She learned not to place her trust lightly, not to mistake smiles for kindness. She learned to stand in solitude without crumbling. But with each betrayal, loneliness pressed harder against her spirit. She carried it like a stone in her chest, heavy but strangely strengthening. For every voice that mocked, for every familiar face that turned away, Amma's silence grew thicker, her resolve stronger. They had abandoned her, yes, but in doing so, they unknowingly forged her into something they could neither break nor bend. The years rolled forward like the steady turning of seasons, and with them came a time of prosperity that bathed the village in pride. The rains fell just enough to nourish the fields, and the soil, rich and generous, offered harvests so abundant that granaries groaned beneath their weight. Goats multiplied, hens laid more eggs than households could consume, and laughter filled the air during market days when traders came from far and wide to bargain for the village's grain, fruits, and woven goods. Drums echoed through the nights as festivals grew longer, fires burned brighter, and joy spilled into every corner of life. The people walked with their heads high, their steps full of confidence. They declared their land blessed, their ways righteous, and their wisdom unmatched. When travelers stopped to rest, villagers boasted of their success, claiming that no misfortune could touch them. The elders told stories of their strength and foresight, weaving tales in which their resilience brought them plenty, leaving out the times when warnings had been given and ignored. Their voices rang with certainty, a certainty born not of humility but of arrogance. Through it all, Amma lived like a shadow on the edge of their light. She had grown older, her face lengthened into the solemn grace of a young woman, but her presence still carried the weight of ridicule. She had no place at the feasts where laughter roared, no part in the dances where feet stamped the earth in joy. When music drifted through the air, she heard it only from afar, sitting beneath the same tree where she had hidden as a child. Her hands worked quietly to mend clothes or tend a small garden patch on the margins of the fields, just enough to keep herself alive. She watched the prosperity of the village with eyes that saw deeper than abundance. In her dreams, she glimpsed shadows stirring at the edges of this golden season, whispers of hunger and grief yet to come. But she no longer spoke. She had learned the futility of her words, the cruelty that followed whenever she tried to warn. Better silence than another wave of laughter, another stone tossed at her pride. The villagers did not notice her silence, nor did they care. Their pride swelled too large, their ears too deafened by songs of plenty. They could not imagine their good fortune faltering, could not believe that the land which now yielded so much could ever betray them. In their eyes, Amma was nothing but a reminder of their past superstitions, a shadow they refused to acknowledge. And so she lived apart, carrying both her gift and her loneliness like two sides of the same coin. The prosperity of the village became a wall between them, blinding the people to their own fragility. They believed themselves untouchable, unshakable, immune to fate's turning hand. But Amma knew what they could not see, that the higher pride climbs, the harder it falls. And already she could feel the air shifting, a quiet tension beneath the songs of joy, as if the earth itself was waiting. Amma's visions had always come like whispers, fleeting, hazy fragments that hovered between dream and memory. But the one that seized her in the middle of a moonless night was no whisper. It was a roar. She woke with her body trembling, her breath ragged, and sweat dampening her thin blanket. In the vision, the fields had withered to dust, their once green stalks brittle and brown. The riverbeds cracked open, empty and dry, like gaping mouths crying for water. Children cried with hollow eyes and sunken cheeks, while elders coughed weakly, their strength gone. Smoke hung in the air, heavy and acrid, and a silence deeper than death covered the land. She had seen famine, a great hunger that would choke the village until even pride could no longer fill bellies. For a long moment she sat frozen, staring into the shadows of her hut. Her gift had always left her torn between fear and responsibility, but never had it been so sharp, so undeniable. This was not a warning of one man's misfortune or the breaking of a branch. This was a vision of calamity that would swallow them all. And though she had long sworn to keep her silence, Amma knew she could not hold this one inside. She could not watch her people, yes, even those who mocked her, walk blind into ruin. At dawn, Amma went into the heart of the village. The marketplace buzzed with laughter as women haggled, men sharpened tools and children chased one another. She stepped into the center, her voice breaking the rhythm of mourning. "Listen to me," she cried louder than she had ever dared. "Dark days are coming. The rains will fail, the land will dry, and our food will not last. You must store your harvests, gather water, and prepare now before it is too late." The square fell quiet for a moment, the kind of silence that stings. Dozens of eyes turned to her, some wide with annoyance, others with amusement. Then, as though cued by some unspoken signal, laughter erupted. A woman carrying yams shook her head and barked, "The spirit's daughter speaks again. Did your dreams tell you that the sky itself will forget us?" A man selling palm wine chuckled, adding, "Or maybe she simply hates to see us prosper. Misery follows her wherever she goes." The laughter spread like fire, and soon even the children were pointing and cackling. Amma's throat tightened, but she stood her ground. "I am telling you the truth," she insisted, her voice cracking with desperation. "You must believe me. If you do nothing, the land will betray you and you will suffer." She reached out a hand as though to pull them closer, to make them see what she had seen. But instead of drawing near, they recoiled, muttering prayers and spitting on the ground as if to cleanse themselves of her words. Someone shouted from the crowd, "She attracts misfortune. Have you not seen how sickness spreads when she speaks? She brings hunger with her tongue." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering. The villagers turned her warning into a weapon against her, twisting her plea for their safety into proof of her curse. A boy threw a clod of dirt that struck her shoulder, and the children erupted in giggles. "Go back to your spirits, Amma," another man sneered. "We have no need of your doom." Tears stung her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She looked at the faces before her, faces she had known since childhood, faces that had once sung songs in celebration but now mocked her with every breath. She had come to save them, and instead they branded her a bringer of disaster. For the first time, Amma understood the full weight of her isolation. She was not simply an outcast, she was their scapegoat, the vessel they poured their fear into so they could keep pretending their world was safe. She turned and walked away, each step heavy with despair. Behind her, laughter and jeers filled the air, louder than ever before, as though mocking her desperation gave them power. But in the quiet of her heart, Amma knew what she had seen was true. Calamity was already stirring, and no matter how fiercely they denied it, the village's pride would not shield them from what was coming. The first sign was the sky. Clouds that once brought life-giving rain drifted past without weeping, leaving the earth beneath them cracked and thirsty. The sun grew harsher, burning the soil until the green of the fields dulled to a sickly yellow. The maize stalks that once reached proudly toward the sky began to droop, their leaves curling like withered hands. Farmers stood in their fields, hands on their hips, waiting for the rain they believed would surely come tomorrow or the day after. But the sky remained pitilessly blue, a cruel expanse that offered no mercy. By the second month, the signs could no longer be ignored. Streams that once bubbled with cool water dwindled to trickles, forcing women to walk farther each day in search of water to fill their jars. The cattle grew thin, their ribs pressing sharply against their hides, their lowing sounds weak and pitiful. Children who once laughed freely in the village square now sat quietly in the shade, listless and weary. Then came the sickness. Hunger's shadow often carries disease in its wake, and soon fevers swept through the village. Coughs echoed in huts at night, mothers pressed trembling hands against their children's foreheads, and elders who had once told stories by the fire now lay silent on their mats. The once proud voices that had boasted of the village's strength grew quieter, tinged with unease. But the blow that shattered the last of their arrogance came when raiders, lean and desperate themselves, descended upon the village. Drawn by the scent of weakness, they stormed the outskirts, seizing what little grain remained and scattering livestock into the bush. The villagers, weakened by hunger, could barely resist. Cries filled the night as families huddled together, clutching whatever scraps they had left. The fires of celebration that once blazed at the heart of the village had been replaced by flames of destruction. The proud village was no longer the shining beacon it had been. Fear clung to every face and hunger gnawed at every belly. Mothers wept as they tried to hush the cries of their children, offering them water in place of food. Fathers, once strong and commanding, sat with slumped shoulders, powerless against the weight of disaster. The square where laughter once echoed now carried only whispers of despair. And yet, through it all, Amma's name began to surface on their lips. Quietly at first, spoken in hushed tones as though saying it aloud might bring another curse. Did she not warn us? Some asked in the darkness of their huts. Did she not tell us the rains would fail? Others nodded grimly, but no one dared admit the truth openly. Pride still lingered, a stubborn ember refusing to die even in the face of ruin. To acknowledge Amma's warning was to confess their cruelty, their blindness, their failure to listen. And so they clung to excuses. The drought was nature's doing. The sickness was fate. The raiders were simply ruthless. Anything but admitting that the girl they had mocked had seen it all coming. Amma herself watched from the margins, her heart heavy with sorrow. She had no satisfaction in their suffering, no joy in seeing her visions come true. The hunger she felt in her own belly matched theirs, and the sickness that crept through the village touched even her. But she carried something they did not, the knowledge that she had tried. She had spoken, pleaded, begged, and still they had laughed. And now, the sound of their laughter had been replaced by cries they could not silence. The village that had once stood tall was collapsing under the weight of its arrogance. Hunger hollowed it out, fear broke its back, and shame hung over it like a dark cloud. But Amma knew this was not the end. The day would come when pride would bend, when desperation would force them to turn to the one they had scorned. For now, though they suffered in silence, unwilling to speak the truth their hearts already knew, Amma had been right all along. It began quietly, like the first crack in a clay pot before it shatters. In the nights filled with coughing and restless children, some villagers started to remember the girl they had mocked. They recalled her voice, trembling yet firm, as she had stood in the market and begged them to prepare. Her words, once drowned by laughter, now echoed in their minds with haunting clarity. When a family buried their youngest child after days of fever, the mother whispered, "Amma said this would come." Her husband silenced her, but his eyes betrayed the same thought. As the drought deepened, the memories sharpened. Men who had dismissed her warnings began to mutter while tending their failing goats. "If only we had stored more grain," one would say, avoiding the eyes of his neighbor. The neighbor, equally haunted, would grunt in agreement but never speak her name aloud. Pride was a hard thing to surrender even when hunger gnawed at their bones. But the losses multiplied. Elders who had once led the village with booming voices fell silent forever, carried to their graves by trembling arms. Children wasted away, their laughter replaced by weak whimpers. Livestock, the pride of many households, either died where they stood or were stolen by raiders who knew the village had grown too weak to resist. Every death was a reminder of the voice they had ignored, the girl they had shamed. Shame began to hang over the village heavier than the heat of the sun. The same people who once mocked Amma in the square now avoided her gaze when she walked past. Mothers pulled their children close, not in fear but in quiet remorse. Men who had spat at her feet found themselves looking away, unable to meet the eyes of the woman they had branded cursed. In hushed corners, regrets surfaced like ghosts. "She tried to warn us. We laughed and now look." The words traveled from hut to hut, fragile and fearful, as though admitting them too loudly might summon more calamity. The tension was thick, unspoken but palpable. It was no longer arrogance that filled the air but the heavy silence of shame. The people could not yet bring themselves to kneel, but the seeds of humility were sprouting in the cracks of their suffering. They had mocked her, rejected her, and turned their backs, but in their hearts the truth was undeniable. Amma had seen what they could not, and they had been too blind, too proud, to listen. It happened slowly at first, like a trickle of water finding its way through dry soil, and then all at once, a flood that could not be stopped. One morning, as Amma sat outside her small hut weaving a basket, she noticed a figure standing a few paces away. It was an old woman who had once called her cursed, the same woman who used to spit whenever Amma passed near the well. Now her back was bent with grief, her eyes swollen from tears. She clutched the thin wrist of a child whose cheeks were hollow with hunger. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "I heard you know herbs. My granddaughter has not eaten for days. Help us." Amma looked at her for a long moment. The bitterness that had taken root in her heart stirred, reminding her of every insult, every cruel laugh. Part of her wanted to turn away, to let the woman taste fully the weight of her own cruelty. But when her gaze fell on the child, too weak even to lift her head, compassion pierced through the bitterness. Without a word, Amma stood and went inside. She returned with a small bundle of dried leaves she had gathered from the forest. "Boil these in water," she said softly. "It will give her strength." That first act opened the floodgates. By the next day another figure came. And then another. Soon there was a line that stretched along the dusty path leading to her hut. Mothers with feverish children, fathers too ashamed to meet her eyes, youths who had once hurled stones at her legs now kneeling with heads bowed. They came with empty hands and empty stomachs, carrying nothing but desperation. The sight was almost surreal. Faces that had once glowed with scorn now dulled by hunger and softened by humility. Amma sat at the doorway of her hut, her back straight, her eyes calm. She listened to their pleas, for food, for medicine, for guidance. Some wept openly, their pride shattered, their voices cracking as they begged for mercy. A few tried to cover their shame with awkward words, saying things like, "We did not know," or "We were